Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoyed the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. This is one particular podcast that I know I've got to do, but I've been dreading for some time, if I'm honest. It's the next in my Afghanistan series, and I've entitled it The Longest Day, because there can be no aspect of being a leader or being a commander that's more difficult than losing people who work for you and who are under your command or under your leadership. And Sunday, the 13th of April, 2008 is most definitely one of the longest days of my life and the most difficult by some margin, I think, when very, very sadly and very quickly, everything we're doing in Afghanistan becomes very, very real, very local. I'd stood on the ramp a number of times prior to that date to bid farewell to casualties, many of them Canadians, some British, some American, going home from different bits of Afghanistan in coffins when we put them on airplanes to send them on their pretty much their final journey home. But obviously when it's your own people and people that have worked directly for you and effectively are doing work that you have directed in one way, shape or form, then it certainly becomes that much more challenging. And that night we lost 2 people in exactly those circumstances. Our outer layer of security for the airfields was the Royal Air Force Regiment. They patrolled off the base. I've already talked about that in a previous podcast because I did quite a few of those patrols myself. And they were routine patrols. We did it all the time. We had very clear plans and routes and concepts of operation in the way they operated and processes to minimize the threat. And I talked about some of those. But you can't completely eliminate the threat. And sadly, that particular night on the 13th of April, just before 7 o'clock, was when we lost Senior Aircraftman Graham Livingstone, known as Livy to his mates, and Senior Aircraftman Gary Thompson. Livy was single, young man, very much with his whole life ahead of him, and was a very, very popular, charismatic guy in the squadron. Gary was a reservist. He was 51 years old. He was the oldest casualty that the UK suffered in the entire 20 years we were in Afghanistan. He was married with 5 daughters and was the managing director of a company back in the UK as obviously many reservists are in those kind of roles. So there's no kind of easy way with dealing with this sort of stuff, but we obviously had to look at, right, what's the immediate impact? How did this all unfold? And what I wanted to talk about a little bit was why this was the longest day. What did we do about it? What happened? What else could we have done? There were 2 others in the vehicle that night, 2 others seriously injured, including Flight Lieutenant Andy Costin. He was the flight commander of the support weapons flight. All these guys were from 3 Squadron, Royal Air Force Regiment. They were the squadron that was out there at the time under the command of Squadron Leader Rich Langley. And I worked with them daily. I knew all of them, particularly the officers, very, very well. And it was therefore that much more difficult when you're in that situation, inevitably. And the first thing is clearly understanding what happened. We found out about it pretty much immediately. Obviously, the team found out about it very much immediately and got me in the loop within minutes. I was then obviously keen to understand what had happened, but equally at the same time as the senior commander there, not getting in the way of actually the actions that needed to be taken because this was still a live incident. We had people in the ground defense area that we needed to recover. We needed to sort the casualties out. We needed to make sure we knew which casualties were where and get the ones back to hospital to get treated as soon as we possibly could, to make sure we recovered everything we could from the battlefield, made sure all the rest of the team was safe. The other thing that immediately goes through your mind when that's happened, and any kind of incident like that, when you're protecting, as they were, a fixed point, albeit a big fixed point, which is a big airfield, is this a bigger threat? Is it just an isolated incident? What is it? And obviously we were pretty clear pretty quickly that it wasn't a bigger threat. It was just a very, very tragic, isolated incident. It turned out when we got to deeper investigation, it was a mine. It was a deliberately placed mine put there by the Taliban to catch us, and it did. It was at what we would call a vulnerable point, or very close to a vulnerable point, which we always took more care at, to know that there was a bigger risk at some of these points, crossroads and depressions where you're going through riverbeds, those kind of things where you know you're going to have to go slowly and you're going to have to be a bit predictable in terms of where you're taking the vehicles and tracking the vehicles. Then all of those kind of areas were the areas that people would take the most care with. But as I've said already, you can't eliminate the risk. You can reduce the risk. But on this particular night, it didn't work out that way. The vehicles that we were using at that stage were essentially general service Land Rovers. They were old style Land Rover Defenders, no mine protection at all. Later vehicles in Afghanistan had the good V-shaped hulls, which deflected the blast up and underneath and away to massively mitigate the kind of problems. So the vehicle would take a lot of damage, but would protect the occupants. That wasn't the case in this instance. It killed the two occupants in the back of the vehicle, and the two in the front were the ones that were injured. And obviously, we went through a process fairly quickly to do that, understand what's gone on, to look at the actions we needed to take, and that was in making sure that the area was secure, that there wasn't going to be a further attack on the guys that were still out on the ground, or indeed wider attack on anything on the airfield, and then look to how we're going to recover these guys and obviously get them back in. The team was well drilled. The team worked very, very effectively as a result of those drills, and got everybody back and got the equipment back, the vehicles back, the people back. We got the wounded to hospital, and the wounded at that stage obviously included the two that subsequently died. They were extracted to the hospital, but couldn't be saved. Their injuries were too severe. At a later stage that night, I can't remember the time, but it was pretty late, I think, by the time this happened, I went down to the hospital, and I will never, ever forget sitting outside the cubicle area, if you like, where Andy Costin was being treated, when his squadron commander, Rich Langley, had to go and tell him that the two guys that were in the vehicle with him had not survived. And that was rightly Rich's job. Rich was the immediate commander to do that, but I really felt for him, because that's the toughest thing to ever have to do, really. And Andy's kind of howl of anguish when he realized that two of the guys that were directly, very much his direct reports in his flight, and they know each other extremely well, work together all the time, were lost. That was a particularly painful thing, and it is unimaginably difficult, I think, in those circumstances. You don't think it's going to happen to you. I think you go through the military life with a degree of immortality, approaching it as I know that these risks are there, and that was the case for me all through my flying career as well. That looking at what I'd done and the kind of things that I'd done, when I look back on it, I think there were tremendous risks, but you don't think of it like that. You just get on and do the job. And that's true for, I think, pretty much everyone. So that was very, very difficult. And that night, until we kind of closed off everything, made sure we dotted and crossed and sorted out everything we needed to, including obviously informing back to the UK, dealing with the kind of next of kin. Informing didn't fall directly to us, but clearly we have to then turn around and pass all the reporting back, making absolutely sure that we've got it precisely right, because there clearly is no room at all for error in that sort of reporting. We did all of that. We eventually, I think, decided that we weren't going to achieve anything else that day, and we needed to kind of get a little bit of rest. So that's what happened. But then the aftermath is the tricky thing as well, because the aftermath of an episode like that is significant and lasting. And one of the first things for me, for sure, was letters to the next of kin, condolence letters that obviously you handwrite and never ever do them any other way, and composing and thinking about what you're going to say to someone in a situation that is nigh on impossible to be even vaguely in their shoes is really, really tough. And, those are hard letters to write, and some have had to write many more than others. And I don't have anything but sympathy for anyone that's had to do that, because I think it's really, really tough thing to do. And a certain amount of stuff to support the public narrative back in the UK that inevitably goes out. The approach we took very much in those days was we would announce fairly quickly that there'd been an incident and that there'd been fatalities. Invariably, we would make sure that we kept the names away from the media, and even if the media had got hold of the names, and sometimes that happened, we'd actually got the media to the right kind of place where they recognized that there was a need for complete privacy on this until the next of kin had been informed. And then clearly there's a more public declaration and series of press releases, if you like, and you can still find those on the government website now. And when I look at what I said now, it brings it kind of all flooding back, really, because my comments on that particular night about the two individuals were as follows. I said both SAC Graham Livingstone and SAC Gary Thompson were bright lights in a vibrant and enthusiastic Air Force Regiment squadron that is utterly focused and professional in discharging the difficult and dangerous task of providing the outer layer of protection and security at Kandahar Airfield. These two enthusiastic, brave, popular and capable men have made the ultimate sacrifice while giving their best. Their loss will be keenly felt by all on this base, but most especially by the members of No. 1 Force Protection Wing and No. 3 Squadron RAF Regiment. The bright lights may have been dimmed, but they will never be forgotten, and my thoughts are very much with both Gary's and Graham's families at this most difficult of times. Those words resonate with me as much now in 2025 as they did when I wrote them in 2008, because I don't ever go past a Remembrance Day without thinking about those two guys and the fact that they were lost in my time at Kandahar. Mercifully, they were the only two that I lost. Many other people in the UK Armed Forces were much, much less fortunate than me in that regard. They lost a lot more people. And I just have immense sympathy for them, because I think if you're in that position, it's tough at any stage, and it never gets easier, and it's always personal, and it's always hard. And I don't think you suddenly become immune to this kind of stuff at all. It's just it's really, really hard. But the show must go on, and the show must go on immediately in these kind of circumstances. You cannot be in a position where you allow the mission to in any way pause unless there's a really, really big reason for doing it. We looked very quickly, obviously, at tactics, at what might have gone wrong, what might have been done differently. Were there any things that we could take as lessons? Were there any things we needed to change and look at to see whether we could not only minimize the risk of such an incident again, but also actually to minimize the impact of an incident like that? And vehicles, I've already mentioned, were one of the things that were being most talked about. Not unreasonably, we were lower in threat than many of the frontline forces were in Helmand Province from a UK point of view, and therefore, in terms of the rollout of new equipment and vehicles, inevitably, then we were not the front of the pack for that. But they did ultimately get newer vehicles towards the end of my time. That started happening. So only a few months really until we were in a situation which would have been very different, I think, for those two guys on that night. The comms was interesting too. I mentioned obviously the handling of next of kin and the way we try and do that. We minimize the comms. So what we do is essentially shut off, because you had the luxury of being able to do that. Anyone's ability to phone off the airfield, including by their own mobile phones, which they shouldn't have been doing anyway, but just to make sure that they didn't, we could actually basically lock that down, jam the mobile phone comms and make sure that it didn't happen. lockdown email comms, etc., as well, to make sure that nobody could talk about stuff. And everybody, even though we had, as I say, some 20 nationalities on the airfield, everyone kind of understood. When you had to do that, that's why there were good reasons for it, and you waited till that comms blanket got lifted, and then you could talk about stuff again. And in the interim, of course, what inevitably happens is back in the UK, there is an announcement that is on the news every time that there was a casualty in Afghanistan, a fatality particularly. It made the news. And you'd have then obviously a lot of people wondering what had actually happened. My wife was no exception to that. She clearly had heard those news reports. Luckily, I think she'd understood from me quite clearly that, if she wasn't seeing someone walking down the drive to tell her that I'd been killed, then that was a good thing, and therefore it probably wasn't me. And as soon as the comms blanket got lifted, then I was on the phone to her to give her, within the bounds of what I could tell her, a bit more detail about what had actually happened, and obviously to have a bit of an opportunity to offload some of that myself as well with her in a discussion. And one of the things that was really interesting was her reflection was that, well, yeah, but you don't need to do that anymore now, because she knew I was doing these patrols. She knew I was going off the base and doing that kind of stuff. And she was obviously completely understandably saying, no, you've done that. You don't need to do it anymore. Almost literally at the time she was saying that, I was hand over the receiver saying tomorrow, and I needed to go out on patrol tomorrow, because this was relatively early in the tour of number 3 Squadron. We had over 200 other guys on the squadron, and they were all men who were understandably very, very worried about what had happened, scared about what might happen to them. And that leading by example bit was really, really important. And nothing on earth, I think, would have stopped me doing what I was then doing, which is to say, look, I need to get back out there. I need to share that risk. I need to put some skin in the game and make sure that that I'm not asking you to do something I'm not prepared to do myself. And of course, you get in the vehicle, and I traveled in the space in the vehicle that basically Gary and Graham were killed in, and so it was the same vehicle, so same type of vehicle, and exactly the same kind of circumstances. So you're carrying risk, and you there's no two ways about that. But it's important, and I think it's really incumbent on any leader in any role, corporate or otherwise, to turn around and be properly prepared to roll your sleeves up, lead by example, get stuck in. Don't ask people to turn around and pull an all-night hard-working shift to do something, to get a deliverable out the door, or get a proposal sorted out, or whatever it happens to be, or face off to some difficult client about something. If you're not prepared to do it yourself, you've got to be prepared to do it yourself. You've got to turn around and put that skin in the game, and make sure you're genuinely putting your money where your mouth is. Really, I think that's such a vital thing to be there. And then you kind of reset, and you move into the next day and the next day and the next day. And you focus, I think, continually back on what could we do differently? What should we do differently? How do we mark all of this in terms of making sure that those individuals that have been lost in such circumstances are absolutely remembered? One of the obvious challenges in a place like Afghanistan is the show does go on, and therefore the casualties are repatriated back to the UK. Things like funerals don't wait for everyone to return. Inevitably, the funerals will happen while we're still out there, unless it's right at the end of a tour, for example. And that's tough on the guys that have obviously not able to go and be there to say farewell to their friends and their colleagues when they would otherwise really have wanted to do that. So there's all sorts of those kind of impacts that do play into this mix. Interestingly, sometime later, I was at an event which was a memorial service for the two guys, and I had a chat with obviously the families of both Graham and Gary, and I then subsequently met and have stayed in contact with Gary Thompson's widow over some time. She's done a remarkable job of kind of stepping up and really being a powerful advocate for bereaved families and doing a lot of work in that regard. I mean, unimaginably tough, really, for a lady who had 5 daughters to have lost her husband when he was a reservist. He's a part-timer. He's not a full-time guy. You would not expect to be in a situation where you lose somebody like that. So for her to then be so powerful, such a strong advocate for so many positive things coming from it, I thought was a remarkable thing for her to do. And I have undying admiration for the way she actually has achieved that. I think for all the rest of us, you don't forget. It dims a bit over time, inevitably, when you face these kind of things. But the specifics of a night like that, certain aspects of it stay with you, I think, forever. And anyone that's been, I think, in any sort of near death or actual death situation is probably going to be equating to that, and whether it's just in a normal kind of setting or if it's in a war zone, as this was. And it is one of those things that you just have to process, and different people deal with it differently, and that's obvious. But I think when you think about looking after people who have gone through traumatic things, it's important to reflect on the fact that people do process this kind of stuff differently. People handle adversity and, I suppose, grief and bereavement and all of those sorts of things very differently. And some do it very quickly, very publicly. Some do it very privately and very slowly. Some bottle it up for ages, never really talk about it, but it's eating away at them in a way that is obviously potentially quite damaging and difficult. So part of what I wanted to say in this is to think about the fact that if you're in any way personally affected by serious grief issues, there are loads of support networks out there. There are loads of people who have been through similar, never identical, but similar circumstances, almost certainly. And there are opportunities to turn around and lean on those networks, get some help, have an opportunity to share, to talk about stuff in a way that is constructive and helpful for everyone involved. I think bottling it all up, holding it back, being kind of emotionless about it can be very difficult and potentially very damaging. And equally, if you are aware of people in your kind of orbit who work around you or just personal friends or whatever, who you know have been through some traumatic thing, whatever it happens to be, then be there for them, be supportive for them, be conscious that they may not want to talk about this now, in the immediate future, ever. Variable depending on the people. But when they are prepared to talk about it, then be there to listen, be there to support. And you can't make it better. You don't need to do wonderful things. You just need to be listening. You need to be providing support. You need to be supportive. And it's really, really, really important that you are able and capable of doing that, because I think just when walking by, as it were, and going, actually, do you know what? I really, I'm sorry, but I haven't got I can't put myself in your situation, and I don't want to talk about that. And that's a disaster. So just be conscious of how you actually handle it if you have people who are ever in that kind of situation. And I think there are more circumstances that are more relatable to people in normal life than you would necessarily think about. I mean, anybody who's had any kind of family drama, lost a relative to a serious illness, lost a relative to an accident, whether it was quick and they didn't have any warning and they didn't have a chance to say goodbye, whether it was slow, painful and drawn out, any one of those sort of things is difficult. And you need to be conscious that one certainty in life is death, and you've got to face it yourself at some point, but you've also got to be ready to help other people through it when it's their loved ones, their family, and so on. It's a difficult episode. It's not something I wanted really to spend too much time on, because it still hurts, I guess, to have lost those two guys. And as I say, I'm very, very grateful. In some ways, it was only two. It could have been much, much worse. I suppose I'd seen a few similar-ish kind of incidents over my flying career where we'd lost a few people in flying accidents. But somehow in that kind of war environment, it's just a bit grittier. And standing on the ramp putting their coffins on the aeroplane to go back to the UK was a tough day for everyone that was involved. And it's one of those things where you might want to think you're Mr. Tough Guy and you're, fairly, hardened and all the rest of it. But I think the reality is that it really hurts everybody involved. And it's not easy to compartmentalize that and move on from it. And, to some extent you need to do the move on from it subsequently, but in the moment you have to be respectful and realize that it's going to hurt and it's going to be full of grief. And that's a challenging place to be. Luckily for me, that was one day and some aftermath days of an otherwise very successful and kind of almost uneventful tour in terms of casualties. As I say, many of my friends and colleagues who served at similar times in Afghanistan, but over in Helmand province in particular, were nowhere near as lucky. They lost a lot more people. They had large number of people in some instances severely wounded. So they had bigger issues than me. But nonetheless, my two guys will stay in my memory forever. Sorry, it's a bit of a downbeat episode. There's no easy way to do anything other than make it a bit of a downbeat episode. But I do think it's important to reflect and remember. And I just wanted to close by saying, Gary and Graham, you will never, ever be forgotten. Rest in peace. I'm not really sure I want to say I hope you've enjoyed this episode, because I don't think it's the kind of enjoyable episode that I normally try and create, and it's a difficult listen probably. But I think it's important. I think it's important to share this kind of stuff, and the good, the bad, and all the rest of it. And therefore, I didn't want to not include an episode about a chapter that was obviously particularly pertinent for me. If you found it useful, interesting, insightful, then please, again, share it, flag it, comment. By all means, give me feedback. I always appreciate that. As I always say on these episodes, if you find it valuable and the kind of stuff that I'm pushing out is valuable, then think about supporting the show. And you can do that via the support the show link. That will take you to Patreon, and you'll see the options that are there. That would really, really be appreciated by me for sure. And I will be back very soon with hopefully much more upbeat, cheerful stuff to talk about. But thanks very much for listening, and all the best. Bye now.